The Texas sun beat down like a hammer in 1875. It baked the plains into a cracked, shimmering wasteland. A cowboy named Daniel rode slow, his world defined by two things: silence and solitude. His cabin was empty, his days were long. He was a man who carried duty, but not companionship. That morning something caught his eye. A second trail crossing the cattle tracks he was following. Bare footprints. Small, hurried, leading straight into a dry creek bed where nothing lived. Something twisted in his gut. Out here, the desert didn't give second chances. He nudged his horse forward. The tracks staggered, weaving like a drunkard. The work of someone at the absolute end of their rope. Then he saw her. A young Apache woman crumpled beneath a mesquite tree. Her dress was in tatters, her feet were torn and bloody. Each breath she took was a shallow, painful thing. She tried to get up when he approached, but her body betrayed her. Daniel's heart clenched. He dismounted slow, his boots crunching on the dry earth, not wanting to spook her. Her eyes snapped open. Fear, pure, cornered animal fear. Daniel didn't say a word. He just held out his canteen. Her eyes darted from the water to his face, suspicion at war with a desperate thirst. Thirst won. She drank, her hands trembling, water spilling down her chin. When she spoke, her voice was a ghost. Nayeli. Her name. A single piece of herself she hadn't lost yet. She was too weak to stand. Daniel lifted her into his arms. She was light, fragile as a bird. He settled her in front of him on the saddle and held her close as they rode, her shivering body a constant reminder of how close she'd come to the edge. By the time they reached his cabin, night was falling. He laid her on his bed, built a fire, and heated some broth. She ate in silence, tears rolling down her cheeks. Not tears of sadness, tears of a body remembering what it felt like to be nourished, to be safe. Daniel sat across from her, just watching. He didn't know it yet, but fate had just dealt him a hand he never expected to play, and the stakes were higher than he could possibly imagine. In the days that followed, Nellie began to heal. She didn't speak much, but her silence was full of life. She mended Daniel's torn shirts with small, perfect stitches. She tended his forgotten garden, coaxing green shoots from the stubborn Texas soil. Daniel's cabin, once a monument to loneliness, was now filled with the sound of her soft humming. A language he didn't understand, but a melody that spoke directly to a part of him he thought had died long ago. He never asked about her past. He just gave her what the world had denied her: patience, food, and safety. And slowly, something new began to grow between them. Trust. One evening, as the sun bled crimson and gold across the horizon, she finally told him. Raiders. They had swept through her village like a firestorm, scattering her people to the wind. She had run for days, hunted by nothing but fear and grief. I have nowhere left to belong, she whispered, and the words were a raw, open wound. Daniel reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His touch was rough, calloused, but steady as stone. Then you're not alone anymore. It wasn't a promise. It was a vow. And in her eyes, for the first time, he saw the flicker of a future. After that night, everything changed. Daniel taught her to ride, his hands guiding hers on the reins. At first she was nervous, but soon her laughter broke free, a sound so pure and bright it startled the birds from the trees. A sound that restarted Daniel's heart. She, in turn, taught him words from her own language. She called him Nan Tan, protector. The world beyond their small ranch, however, was not so kind. Whispers started to snake through the nearby settlement. A lone cowboy and an Apache woman. It was a scandal, a danger. The whispers grew louder until one day they became a sneer. A rancher named Jedediah Kane, a man whose land bordered Daniel's, mocked him openly in town. The words were ugly, aimed at Nayeli, meant to cut deep. Daniel's hand curled into a fist. The next moment, Kane was on his back in the dust, spitting blood. The message was clear. Daniel, the quiet, lonely rancher, stood with her, without apology, without shame. That night, Nayeli came to him by the fire. She didn't speak. She just looked at him, her eyes shining with a gratitude that went beyond words. She saw not just a protector, but a partner. Later, a storm rolled in. Thunder cracked open the sky. Lightning bleached the plains white. Nellie began to tremble, the storm outside triggering a storm of memory inside her. The fire, the raids, the terror. Daniel wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight against the chaos. "You're safe," he whispered, his voice a low anchor in the howling wind. She clung to him, and in that desperate, fragile moment, her lips formed a single, trembling word. Husband. The word struck Daniel like lightning. It was more than a title. It was a choice, a destination. He held her closer, and in the heart of the storm, the lonely cowboy and the lost Apache woman found their home. But Jedediah Kane was not a man who forgot a grudge, and he was just getting started. The word husband settled into the cabin's timber, becoming the new foundation of their lives. But outside their small sanctuary, the world was turning against them. Jedediah Kane had been publicly shamed, and a man like Kane watered the seeds of his grudges with whiskey and violence. He owned the biggest ranch in the county, and he saw Daniel's defiance not just as an insult, but as a threat. Kane started small. He spread rumors in the settlement. The Apache woman was a witch, he said. She'd put a spell on Daniel. She was a spy for her people, waiting for the right moment to lead a war party down on their peaceful town. Fear is an easy crop to grow in dry soil. The whispers took root. People in town who had once nodded at Daniel now turned their backs. The storekeeper started triple-checking his count. Old friends suddenly found reasons to be somewhere else when Daniel rode in. Daniel didn't care. Let them whisper. He had Nellie. That was enough. But then things escalated. A section of Daniel's fence was cut in the night. Cattle wandered off, lost to the plains. A week later, his well was fouled, the water tainted with oil. These weren't accidents. They were messages. One night, Daniel was awakened by a strange orange glow. He looked out the window. The barn was on fire. He and Nayeli fought the blaze with wet blankets and buckets of water, but it was too late. They could only watch as the structure collapsed into a heap of glowing embers. The next morning, Daniel found a single arrow stuck in the scorched earth near the barn. It wasn't Apache. It was a cheap, poorly made arrow, the kind a white man might fashion to make it look like an Indian raid. It was a framed job, a warning. "He's trying to drive us out," Daniel said, his jaw tight with a rage he hadn't felt in years. "This is not about us," Nellie said quietly, her eyes scanning the horizon. "This is about the land." Daniel looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "The raiders who attacked my village," she said, her voice dropping. "They were not just warriors. There were white men with them. They were not looking for food or horses. They were looking for this." From a small leather pouch at her waist, she pulled out a piece of dried, flattened hide. Etched into its surface was a map. "My father was a chief," Nali explained. "This map leads to the Canyon of the Sleeping Spirits. It is a sacred place, but it is also a rich place. There is silver there, more than any white man has ever seen." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Jedediah Kane wasn't just a prejudiced rancher. He was a thief and a murderer. The raid on her village wasn't random. It was a targeted hunt for the map, and now he knew where it was. "He thinks I have it," Daniel realized. "He thinks you gave it to me." "He will not stop," Nellie said. "Not until he has the map, and we are both dead." That night they didn't sleep. They sat by the fire, the map spread between them, a single rifle on the table. The silence of the ranch was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, waiting. Just before dawn, the attack came. Gunshots shattered the quiet. Bullets ripped through the cabin walls. Daniel shoved Nayeli to the floor, grabbing the rifle. He fired back through the window, a seasoned rancher who knew how to defend his home. But Nellie was not a woman who hid from a fight. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the hearth and moved to the door, her eyes blazing with a warrior's fire. When one of Kane's men tried to kick the door in, she swung the skillet with all her might. There was a sickening crack, and the man fell back with a scream. The fight was brutal and short. Daniel was a good shot, and Nayeli was a fierce defender. They drove the attackers back, leaving two of them wounded and groaning in the dirt. As the sun rose, casting a clean light on the carnage, a lone rider approached. It was the sheriff, but he wasn't there to help. He dismounted, his face a grim mask. Daniel, he said, his hand on his gun, I'm placing you under arrest. Arrest? Daniel stared in disbelief. For what? Defending my home? For harboring a fugitive Apache, the sheriff said, his eyes cold, and for the murder of Jedediah Kane. From behind the sheriff's horse, one of Kane's men dragged a body into the clearing. It was Jedediah, a knife buried in his chest, a knife that looked exactly like Daniel's. It was another frame job, and this time, there were no witnesses to say otherwise. The trap had been sprung, and it was perfect. The sheriff's eyes were cold and empty. He was a puppet, and Jedediah Kane had been pulling the strings, but now Kane was dead, and someone else was in charge. This is a lie, Nellie said, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised them all. This man, she pointed at one of the wounded attackers, he is the one who killed Kane. I saw it. The wounded man laughed, a pained, ugly sound. The word of an Apache woman against three honest, God-fearing men? I like my chances, the sheriff nodded. Take them. They were dragged from the cabin, their home, their sanctuary. As they were forced onto horses, Nellie's eyes locked with Daniel's. There was no fear in her gaze, only a burning, unbreakable promise. They would not be broken. But as they rode toward the settlement, toward a jail cell and a hangman's noose, a new, horrifying thought struck Daniel. Jedediah Kane had wanted the map, but he had never gotten it. Nellie still had it, which meant that whoever had killed Kane and framed Daniel for the murder, they were still out there, and they still wanted the map. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning of a much deadlier game, and they were no longer just defending their home. They were fighting for their lives against an enemy they couldn't even see. The jail cell was a cage of iron bars and cold stone. Daniel paced the small space, his mind racing. The frame was perfect. Kane's men would testify they saw him stab their boss. The sheriff would back their story. By the time the circuit judge arrived, the verdict would be a foregone conclusion. He was a dead man. Nellie was in the cell next to his. She sat on the hard cot, perfectly still, her face a mask of calm. But Daniel could see the storm in her eyes. She still had the map, hidden somewhere in her clothes. The real killer knew that, which meant she was still a target. The first twist came at dusk. The town doctor, a quiet, bookish man named Elias Vance, came to check on the wounded men from the fight. He was a man Daniel had always trusted, one of the few in town who treated Nellie with simple decency. As Dr. Vance passed Daniel's cell, he stumbled, dropping his medical bag. As he bent to pick up his scattered supplies, his hand brushed the bars of Daniel's cell. He pressed a small, folded piece of paper into Daniel's hand. Daniel waited until the doctor was gone, then unfolded the note. The message was short, the handwriting hurried. They're moving you tonight. Be ready. The note was a spark of hope in the darkness. They had an ally. But who were they? And where were they moving him? Hours crawled by. The saloon across the street grew loud, then quiet. The moon rose high in the sky. Just after midnight, Daniel heard the scrape of a key in the main lock. It wasn't the sheriff. It was his deputy, a young man named Miller. Miller's face was pale, his hands shaking. Come on, he whispered, unlocking Daniel's cell. There's no time. What about Nellie? Daniel demanded. She's the reason we're here, a new voice said. Dr. Vance stood in the doorway, a shotgun held steady in his hands. Kane's real partner is making his move. He can't let her testify. The doctor's words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Kane had a partner, someone with power, someone who could control the sheriff. Suddenly, it all made sense. The sheriff hadn't been working for Jedediah Kane. He'd been working for the partner, the man who was now tying up loose ends. Who is it? Daniel asked as they hurried Nellie out of her cell. The last man anyone would suspect, Dr. Vance said grimly. They slipped out the back of the jailhouse into a moonless alley. 2 horses were waiting. Where are we going? Nellie asked. Somewhere safe, Deputy Miller said. There's an old line shack up in the hills. You can hide there. But as they mounted the horses, a new sound reached them, the slow, rhythmic tolling of the church bell. 1, 2, 3 times. It was a signal. From both ends of the alley, armed men appeared, blocking their escape. They were trapped. And then, from the shadows of the saloon porch, a figure stepped into the dim light. He was holding a lantern and his face was calm, almost serene. It was the town preacher. "Evening, doctor," the preacher said, his voice smooth as silk. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." His eyes weren't on Daniel. They were on Nellie, on the map. The preacher, the moral authority of the town, the man who had railed against the sin and corruption of men like Cain. He was the partner, the mastermind. "You," Dr. Vance whispered, his face a mask of disbelief. "Silver is a powerful temptation, doctor," the preacher said with a cold smile. "It can make a man do regrettable things. Cain was a useful tool, but he became a liability." The puzzle pieces slammed together in Daniel's mind. The preacher had used Cain to drive them off the land. When that failed, he killed Cain, framed Daniel, and planned to take the map from Nayeli after she was imprisoned and helpless. It was a brilliant, ruthless plan. "The map, Mrs. Blackwood," the preacher said, using her married name for the first time, a cruel mockery. "Give it to me, and I'll let your husband live, at least until the judge gets here." It was a liar's promise, and everyone knew it. Nellie looked at Daniel, her eyes asking a silent question. Daniel gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Never." In that split second, everything happened at once. Dr. Vance fired the shotgun. The blast roared through the alley. One of the preacher's men went down. Daniel shoved Nayeli behind him, pulling the small knife he always kept in his boot. Deputy Miller drew his pistol and fired, providing cover. The alley erupted in a storm of gunfire and smoke. Daniel fought with the desperation of a man with everything to lose. He was no gunslinger, but he was a survivor. He and Nayeli, back to back, moved through the chaos, a single, unstoppable force. When the smoke cleared, the preacher was gone, vanished into the night, but he had left behind a scene of carnage. Two of his men were dead. Deputy Miller was slumped against a wall, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. "Go," Miller gasped, pressing his gun into Daniel's hand. "Get her out of here. Get the map to the law. The real law." Dr. Vance was already tending to the deputy, but it was clear he was fading fast. Daniel and Nayeli had no choice. They leaped onto the horses and galloped out of the alley, leaving the dying deputy and the wreckage of their hopes behind. They were free, but they were also fugitives. The law was corrupt, the town was hostile, and the real killer was still out there, hunting them. And he would not stop until he had the silver. For weeks they lived like ghosts. They rode by night, slept by day, never staying in one place for more than a few hours. The plains were a vast, unforgiving wilderness, but Daniel knew them like the back of his hand. He found hidden springs, sheltered canyons, places where they could rest and heal. Nellie's silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the watchful, patient silence of a hunter. She taught Daniel how to move without a sound, how to read the signs of the land, how to live as one with the wild. Their roles had reversed. She was no longer the rescued. She was the teacher. He was no longer the protector. He was the student. The map was a constant weight between them, a promise of wealth and a death sentence. "We have to get it to the Texas Rangers," Daniel said one night as they huddled by a small, smokeless fire. "They're the only law the preacher can't buy." "Austin is 100 miles away," Nellie said, "and he will have men watching every trail." "Then we won't take the trails," Daniel replied. Their journey was a testament to survival. They lived off the land, their bond forged in the crucible of shared hardship. They were no longer a cowboy and an Apache woman. They were a single entity, a two-person clan fighting for their future. The final confrontation came in a place of ghosts, an abandoned Spanish mission, its adobe walls crumbling under the relentless Texas sun. They had stopped there for water and found the preacher waiting for them. He wasn't alone. He had a dozen men with him, hired guns with dead eyes and steady hands. "This is the end of the trail, Daniel," the preacher said, his voice echoing in the mission's courtyard. "Give me the map, and I will give you a quick death." "You'll get nothing from us," Daniel shouted back, his rifle at the ready. The firefight was a whirlwind of dust and death. Daniel and Nayeli fought with the desperate courage of those with nothing left to lose. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they had something the hired guns didn't. They had a reason to fight. In the end, it came down to two men, Daniel and the preacher, facing each other across the mission's dusty courtyard, both of their guns empty. The preacher lunged, a knife appearing in his hand. But Daniel was ready. They grappled in the dirt, a brutal, primal fight for survival. It was Nellie who ended it. An arrow fired from the mission's bell tower flew straight and true, burying itself in the preacher's chest. He collapsed in the dust, his eyes wide with a final, shocked surprise. In the silence that followed, Daniel looked up at Nellie. She stood silhouetted against the setting sun, a warrior queen, the savior of their lives. Weeks later, they stood before the captain of the Texas Rangers in Austin. The map lay on his desk, along with Daniel's and Nayeli's sworn testimony. The story of the preacher's greed and corruption sent shockwaves through the territory. Justice, true justice, finally came to the small Texas settlement. The silver from the Canyon of the Sleeping Spirits was used to build a new school, a new church, a new future for the town, a portion of it set aside for the Apache tribes who had been wronged. Daniel and Nayeli returned to their ranch. The cabin, scarred by bullets, was a testament to their survival. The whispers in town had been replaced by a quiet, profound respect. One evening, as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset, Nellie placed her hand on her belly. She looked at Daniel, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face. Daniel's heart filled with a joy so fierce it stole his breath. He had started his journey as a lonely cowboy in an empty land. He had found a wife, a partner, and now, a future. Their love story became a legend in that corner of Texas. A story of a cowboy and an Apache warrior who had faced down a corrupt world and built a life together, proving that the strongest bonds are not forged in peace, but in the fires of adversity. A story that reminded everyone that sometimes the greatest treasures are not found in the ground, but in the heart of another. If their story of courage and resilience moved you, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. That way you'll never miss another tale where the lines between good and evil get blurred, and ordinary people are forced to do extraordinary things. So let me ask you this. When you're faced with your own dry creek bed, your own moment of truth, do you ride on by, or do you stop and lend a hand, no matter the cost? Think about it, because the story you tell with your life is the only one that truly matters.